Daily on Bible School Radio 91.3.
Portions of KDKR programming do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or staff.
Prudent Money with Bob Brooks is sponsored by the Prudent Money Foundation on 91.3.
So, what is the probability that you will become successful? Today, we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Good afternoon. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thanks so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Well, with every goal, you have a probability of success and a probability of failure. Today, we're going to take a look at what it takes to be successful. Kyle Austin Young, a writer for Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and Psychology Today, has developed a probability and testing framework that has been tested in many ways of life. Such businesses, art, education, philanthropy, politics, sports, and a whole lot more. He is here today to talk about his latest book, Success is a Numbers Game, Achieving Bigger Goals by Changing the Odds. Well, Kyle, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
I got to tell you, I really do love this book. We talk on the program about the importance of probabilities a lot, yet I find myself estimating the odds, if you will, because, unlike your book, your book takes it to a whole nother different level, but a great book to start a new year of success.
I agree with that. I think that this is a book for people with goals, and I don't say that to be self-serving, but I wrote this book actually with the goal of trying to help people. It frustrates me to see people failing at goals where I feel like they could have and should have been successful.
Oh, yeah. When you think about the percentages of people that, the different surveys they take, they can't even remember what their goals were at the beginning of the month, beginning of January. And what a great time to turn the key and do something different, something with this focus on probabilities. Now, the premise of the book is that every goal you're presuming has two hidden numbers attached to it, a probability of success and a probability of failure. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of us fail to even consider the fact that our goals have a chance of succeeding and a chance of failing. We sometimes lean more into the thinking that if it's meant to happen, it'll happen. And I believe that there are things in life that go like that. I also believe that there are areas of life where we have an opportunity to change our outcomes depending on how intentionally we approach our goals. So I've created a framework that gives people the ability to estimate how likely they are to get the outcome they're looking for in pursuit of a goal. And then I try to teach people how to change their odds to put themselves in a better position than they started with.
Now, you write in the book that when people accomplish challenging goals, we say that they beat the odds. What's wrong with that notion?
I don't think that people really do beat the odds. I think that a lot of times when we examine a success story that seems unlikely, it can actually be explained in the context of how many people failed under the same circumstances. So if you think about someone who has a 1% chance of success, what we're really saying, it's not that it's impossible for them to accomplish that goal, whatever it might be. What we're actually saying is that we would expect one person out of every 100 to be successful, and we would expect the other 99 to fail. Over the course of 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 10 million people attempting that goal, there are going to be success stories. I don't think they beat the odds. I think that they were the beneficiaries of these societal odds. One of the things I encourage people to understand is the power of repeated attempts. Sometimes you don't have to beat the odds, you only have to play them. There's a well-known statistic that 9 out of 10 businesses fail. Well, I've met a few entrepreneurs and interviewed even more who took that advice to heart, and it ultimately was one of the things that convinced them to start 10 or more businesses, which put them in a position to ultimately achieve success.
Now, Kyle, you write in the book, many of the odds you hear are actually made up or misinterpreted. Talk a little bit about that.
I apologize. Would you repeat that question for me?
Sure. You write in the book that many of the odds that you hear are made up or misinterpreted.
Yes, I believe that. I give some examples in the book of even news stories where people have reported odds that aren't even remotely accurate. I'll share a couple of examples. These are some headlines that I found kind of funny. One was Texas man survives 1 in a million chance of being struck by lightning. That's a news headline from a local outlet. Another one, there are 3 variations of similar ones, but all of these people are reporting the idea that your odds of being struck by lightning are 1 in a million. And that's not even remotely accurate. If you were to look at the actual published statistics, you find that the odds are closer to, let me see, I don't have this one memorized off the top of my head, but 1 in 15,300, nowhere close to 1 in a million. This is a misunderstanding of a statistic that your odds of being struck by lightning in any given year are roughly 1 in a million, but over the course of your lifetime, they're quite a bit higher. And I give 3 examples in the book and a quote from an emergency room doctor telling you numbers that are exactly the opposite of that. And so sometimes it's important to look beyond the published data that we see and try to do what I recommend that we do, which is create a success diagram where we list out everything that has to go right in order for us to accomplish a goal. And by breaking big predictions down into smaller ones, we have the opportunity to estimate how likely we are to accomplish each step in the process. And then with some really simple math, we can get an overall outlook for how likely we are to have success.
You also state that odds are often weighed down by people who make dumb decisions. How do dumb decisions factor into the equation?
Well, when you think about a base rate, what they're ultimately doing is they're saying, okay, 1 million people tried to accomplish this goal, 100,000 succeeded, therefore there's a 10% chance of success and 90% chance of failure. But that doesn't take into account the fact that there's a good chance that you are above average. There's a good chance that you are somewhere at least average, and that you're going to potentially experience more success than all the people who were below average did. The odds are being weighed down by their lack of success, and a lot of times published statistics fail to take into account our unique attributes. So an example that I like to give is, let's talk about your odds of playing in the National Basketball Association. That's a goal that a lot of us had as children. I know I did. If you are under 6 feet tall and the average U.S. male is 5'9", then your odds are 1 in 1.2 million. Those are terrible odds. Terrible to pursue a goal where your chance is 1 in 1.2 million. But what's really interesting is even as you get a little bit taller, your odds change. If you're between 6 feet tall and 6'3", your odds go up to 1 in 100,000. If you're between 6'4" and 6'7", your odds go to 1 in 8,000. Between 6'8" and 6'11", 1 in 200. And what's really remarkable is if you're over 7 feet tall, your odds of playing in the NBA, at least in the United States, are actually 1 in 7. 1 out of every 7 people in this country who are over 7 feet tall are playing in the National Basketball Association. And it's remarkable to see how our odds of success can change when we just make incremental changes in just one of our attributes, only the attribute of height in this case. And for that reason, I think it's important to recognize that the base rates that we're seeing might tell us, your odds of accomplishing this goal are 1 in 1.2 million. But what if I'm above average in this area? What if I'm taller than the average person? What if I'm smarter than the average person? What if I'm willing to work harder than the average person? There's a good chance that that's going to change your outlook.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. I do appreciate it. Kyle Austin Young is here today to talk about his book, Success is a Numbers Game, Achieve Bigger Goals by Changing the Odds. This is a question that comes to my mind. I'm not sure that I didn't see this addressed in the book, but how does time affect the probability of an event happening? So, for instance, for example, is it factored in when you consider a certain stock market event happens on average every 10 years and we're in year 15? I mean, how would you calculate those odds? How does that factor in?
Yes, I'm not a financial advisor, and I'm hesitant to give any kind of financial advice, but I can tell you that your odds of success can be understood as the odds of each thing that has to go right multiplied together. And so I'll give an example of that. It's entirely possible that someone could take that and apply it to other contexts. But let's say that you're training to run a marathon. That's a goal that you've set for yourself. And you hire a running coach, and he says that there are 3 things that you have to do if you want to be successful in this goal. I need you to eat, sleep, and train exactly the way that I tell you to. If you do those 3 things exactly the way I tell you, then you're going to be ready on race day. If you don't, if you cheat in any of these areas, if you're unfaithful, you're not consistent, then there's no way you're going to be able to run such a long distance. You're just not going to be prepared. So in this scenario, there's 3 things that have to go right. We need to eat, sleep, and train according to a specific plan, a regimen that's been created for us. So let's ask ourselves the question, how likely do we think we are to be able to stick with each of these things? And I'm going to use some really easy made-up numbers and just say 70% across the board. 70% chance I'll eat the way I'm supposed to, a 70% chance I'll sleep the way I'm supposed to, a 70% chance I'll train the way I'm supposed to. Well, what many people do at that point is they fall into a trap called averaging. When they feel good about the individual prerequisites in their goal, they assume that their overall outlook is also positive. But in reality, that's not how the math works. We actually have to multiply those three numbers together to find our odds of success. And if we do that, if we multiply 0.7 by 0.7 by 0.7, we find that we only have a 34% chance of accomplishing this goal. So in the context of other goals, you mentioned investing, but whatever the case might be, if you're starting a business, if you're trying to get a promotion or get hired for a coveted position, what you need to do is try to find what are the individual things that are going to have to go right for the outcome that I want to actually happen. And when you break that big prediction down into smaller ones, you have an opportunity to make more accurate estimates. That's the same system that many of the leading forecasters in the world use to predict major world events. And you can do it in your own life to get a more accurate sense of how likely you are to accomplish an important goal.
You know, in the book, you spell out 5 key points that define probability. Let's just focus in on one. I like to cover as much as we can. There's so much detail in the book. But talk about key point number 3. All other things being equal, the more steps that have to go right for you to succeed, the lower your odds of success. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, it's absolutely true. The more things that have to go right, the lower your odds are going to be. And the reason for that is a little bit of what I just gave an example of, that we have to multiply together the odds of each thing that has to go right. And when we stop to consider all of the things that have to go right, we often find that we've maybe not taken them as seriously as we should. There's things that we've left out of the equation. So I'll give you a really extreme example. Let's say you have a goal, a complicated goal, maybe a policy change. Maybe you're trying to change something in society. There's 100 things that have to go right for you to ultimately be successful. If you even have a 99% chance of every single one of them going right individually, there's 100 things that have to go right, you have a 99% chance of each and every one. Your odds of ultimately succeeding is only 36.6%. If those are true prerequisites to your success. Every time you add another prerequisite onto the equation, the math changes. And so it's important to try to design very straightforward paths to our goals, because if we're relying on things that we don't have to be relying on, we're ultimately hurting our odds.
In the book, you tell the reader how to, and you mentioned this a little while ago, tell the reader how to create a success diagram. Tell us basically what that is to begin with.
Sure, absolutely. So again, my encouragement to people is to try to identify what has to go right in order for you to get the outcome you want. And a success diagram is a list of everything that has to go right. And then beneath each thing that has to go right, I list those out left to right. Beneath each thing that has to go right, I try to think of what are the potential bad outcomes that could happen instead of what I want to happen. And the reason for that is when most of us pursue goals, a lot of people give us the advice to think positive. They say, don't worry about what will go wrong. That'll just discourage you. Just try to visualize it going right. I'm not a big believer in the idea that just visualizing something going the way we want is ultimately going to change the future. I don't see a lot of wisdom in that. Where I do think we have an opportunity to practice wisdom is when we do the exact opposite. I encourage people to think negative. I encourage people to try to identify the potential bad outcomes that could happen instead of what they want. And the reason for that is we can understand probability similar to the way we've traditionally understood matter. A lot of us have heard the statement that matter can't be created or destroyed. It can just be transferred and rearranged. And the same is true when it comes to our odds of success. The odds that we want can't just be conjured into existence. They are currently existing in the potential bad outcomes that could happen instead of what we want. If we're flipping a coin and we want it to land on heads, the other outcome is it could land on tails. That's where the other 50% of the odds are. And in our lives, when we identify the potential bad outcomes, we have an opportunity to use our creativity and to be really intentional in trying to find ways to take the risk out of our goals. So we talked earlier about the goal of maybe trying to run a marathon. Maybe we need to stick to a certain training regimen. Well, what are the bad outcomes that could keep that from happening? What if it's raining on a day when we need to train? What if we lose our motivation as time goes on? What if we suffer an injury? Every single one of those are things that we have the opportunity to be proactive in trying to address. And as we make those bad outcomes less likely to happen, we can increase our chances of getting exactly what we want.
Well, Kyle, starting out, I would imagine that you want to figure out if the odds are in your favor or not. And you define 2 ways to go about this process. One way you call an easy hack, and the other a predictive hack. What are the differences between the two?
Sure, they're the same, except one has numbers and one doesn't. So I've already kind of given you an example of a predictive hack with the marathon. We broke that down into smaller predictions. We need to eat, sleep, and train the way that our running coaches told us to. We think there's a 70% chance that we'll do each of those things. That's a 34% chance overall. A predictive hack, or that's a predictive hack, excuse me, an easy hack just takes the numbers away and allows you to improve your odds of success without math, without numbers, without any of the estimating or calculating. So an example of that is, I think about the time when I applied for my first job after graduating from college. I was 21 years old. This was well over a decade ago. And I wasn't excited about the entry-level positions I was seeing. I wanted to pursue something more audacious than that and try to accelerate my career. So I did something really bold. I applied to become the product development director of a growing health organization. If I were successful in getting this job, I was going to be managing people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, people with PhDs and master's degrees. And again, I was this new graduate, a kid in his early 20s. So when I did that, I stopped, and after I submitted the application, I got an interview, and I knew that I actually had a chance, and I wanted to make the most of it. So before I went in for that interview, I stopped and I tried to think, what are the potential bad outcomes that could happen instead of what I want? What I wanted was for them to offer me the job. So what were the reasons they might not? One of the reasons that I identified was they might not offer me the job because of how young I looked. They might take one look at me and say, this kid's too young to run this team. I don't have confidence in him. So a way that I responded to that, very simple, I grew a beard. I tried to look older than I was. I dressed in a way that added a few years. And when I showed up, I looked, instead of looking 21, I looked closer to maybe 28, 29. That took a little bit of the pressure off. Another bad outcome that I identified, a potential bad outcome, was it was possible that they'd be concerned about my lack of experience. I didn't have a resume. I just graduated college. So what I did is I typed up a full plan and proposal for how I was going to turn this department around. And anytime they asked questions about my past, I would redirect the conversation to be about the future of the department, where I had this spiral-bound plan. It was pretty much a book for everything I was going to do. One of the third bad outcomes I identified, and this is the final one I'll share, is the risk that maybe they thought I wouldn't get along with the existing team because I was so much younger. There'd be this generational gap. So I did something that I'm still doing today. I asked an existing team member if they'd read any books lately as a department, and she mentioned 3 different titles. I went out and read all 3, and when I showed up for the interviews, I had the ability to speak the company's inside language. I knew their jokes, I knew their jargon, I could make references that they understood that other people didn't. In one case, I was actually in a group interview with other people who were twice my age, much more experienced than me, these different candidates who were applying for the same job. And at one point I made a joke. There was a book out at that time, again, this was a while ago, called The Wuffy Factor. It was about how to earn trust in the market, how to convince buyers to ultimately put some faith in your brand. And I remember somebody suggested an idea, and I said, I think that's an idea that could generate a lot of wuffy for our organization. And I remember looking around and seeing the eyes of these other candidates bulging out of their heads, wondering, what on earth did he just say? What is he talking about? But then I looked at the existing team members, and they were all laughing and nodding because they knew what I meant.
Sure.
They were all talking about a book that they were familiar with. So ultimately, I was given that job. I got the offer. I became the product development director of this organization at 21 years old. It dramatically accelerated my career. And I believe that what made that possible was creating a success diagram of what had to go right, taking the time to think about what could go wrong, and using some of my God-given creativity to ultimately look for solutions that tilted the odds in my favor. So that's an easy hack.
Now, Kyle, you also talk about a probability hack. Now, am I getting these confused, or is this different?
These are both examples of probability hacking. To me, probability hacking is getting a sense of your current odds of success and trying to identify your bad outcomes using your creativity to make those less likely, systematically de-risking your goals.
Now, after you create your success diagram, you write about any interesting questions to think about. Is there an easier path to the goal that I want? Now, how do you go about asking that question? I mean, considering people tend to make things a little bit harder than they need to be.
One of the really nice things about a success diagram is it gives you a context in which you can ask for advice. I have historically been a little bit averse to asking for advice, and it's not because I think I know everything, but it's because I often find that the advice that I'm given is more a reflection of other people's contexts and other people's goals than it is of mine. I remember back to a time when I was considering taking on a new consulting client. It was going to be a contract that would pay a lot of money, but it was also going to come with some complexity that was going to lead to a lot of stress. And I wasn't sure if I should take it or not. So I went out to some different friends and colleagues, and I asked for their advice. And what was frustrating at the time was it was split right down the middle. About half of them said, take the money, it's worth the stress. And about half of them said, don't take the money, why would you want that stress? And at first I was confused by that. It didn't seem very helpful. But then I noticed a trend. I noticed that almost without fail, every single person who I asked for advice who had less money than I did encouraged me to take the contract and not worry about the stress it might create. And everybody I asked who had more money than I did said, I don't know why you would deal with such a stressful situation. And what that taught me was, again, that these people's advice had more to do with their goals and their context than it did with mine. What's great about a success diagram is it allows you to ask advice with the context built in. When you show someone this diagram and say, here's the goal that I'm pursuing, here's everything that has to go right, here are the things that could go wrong, tell me what I'm missing, they have the ability to speak into your situation in a powerful way. They can come in and say, I see you're taking a path here. This is a little roundabout. I think there's a faster path to this. Or I can make an introduction that'll take a few of these prerequisites off the table. I can give you some advice that'll help you avoid this bad outcome. So as we try to design the most straightforward paths to our goals, I find that creating this visual, which allows other people to quickly enter into our context, is a really important tool for collaboration.
We're talking about Kyle's book, Success is a Numbers Game, Achieve Bigger Goals by Changing the Odds. And as you remember, in January, we talk about goals a lot. This is a great book to kind of kickstart a good year in 2026. Let's talk a little bit about being a decision maker. And I'm a big believer in this as a skill set that we've got to always keep our eyes on. You know, key to future success. Give us some tips for better decision making.
Well, I think in a lot of ways it comes back to this idea that when you have a picture of what needs to go right for you to get what you want, and when you have something that also outlines the things that could go wrong, it gives you the ability to, again, make decisions in a context. You now have the ability, if you're trying to decide, should I hire candidate A or candidate B? Well, reference your success diagram and ask myself, how would hiring candidate A affect these potential bad outcomes? Is it going to make any of them less likely? Does he or she bring in these capabilities or attributes that are going to be really useful in some of these situations? When we apply our decisions to the context, it makes it easier to find the right answer. A lot of people, when they're making a decision, there's this fear of option overwhelm. What if I have too many options to choose from and it makes me ineffective? I don't worry about that as much, and the reason is I find that it doesn't matter how many options you have if you're able to weigh them against a clear standard. I think about the story of Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison is credited with inventing the first practical incandescent lamp. And the reason that we say it like that is he wasn't by any means the only person trying to do it. He wasn't necessarily the first person to invent any kind of an incandescent lamp. The race was to find a filament that could glow hot enough to ultimately produce light without catching on fire or burning out too quickly. What set Thomas Edison apart on this race for valuable patents is he experimented with 6,000 different plant materials to find the ideal filament. And he ultimately learned that carbonized bamboo, which would not have been my first starting point, glowed for more than 1,200 hours when electrified and could be used really efficiently and effectively inside of this incandescent lamp. And it helped set him on the trajectory of a very successful career as an inventor. You think about 6,000 different options, that's got to be overwhelming. Well, it's not when you're just standing there with a timer seeing which one glows the longest without catching on fire. And I find that success diagrams give us the ability to harness some of that same advantage. When we have a picture of what has to go right in order to accomplish our goals, what could go wrong instead, we have the ability to apply our options up against this standard and make a decision that makes the most sense as we head into the future.
Kyle, we have about a minute left. I just want to say you have a lot of case studies, which I love a lot of the stories in the book. What was your favorite case study or story that you wrote about?
Oh, goodness, it's a great question. I think one of the ones that I really enjoyed is Marilyn Monroe's rise to stardom. Somebody's working in an aviation munitions factory when a photographer comes to take some pictures and discovers her. She goes on to be a model and then ultimately a Hollywood star. I think that so many of us are reverse engineering these success stories that we hear about, but in many times we're reverse engineering the stories of people who just got lucky. If somebody wanted to be an actress, I would not give them the advice to go work at an aviation munitions factory.
Right.
So it's very important for us to stop and understand where that success came from to make sure that we're taking away the right lessons.
The book is Success is a Numbers Game, Achieve Bigger Goals by Changing the Odds. Just real quick, Kyle, how has your book been received?
People are enjoying it. We actually sold out the hardcover on Amazon on the first day, and so there were some delays in shipping, but that's all been moved over now.
That's
and you
awesome.
can get a copy quickly if you'd like to.
Well, listen, congratulations on your book. Once again, Success is a Numbers Game, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks a lot for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Talk a little bit about the beginning of a year in January and how we have the opportunity to do things different. You go through a year, kind of get beaten down by the same old things, and just wonder, how come I'm not getting to my goals or reaching where I feel like God wants me to be? And it's a great opportunity to do something different. And this book's got a lot of tips and techniques. And once again, success is a numbers game. This is Bob Brooks. You got a question for me, please go to the website at prudentmoney.com and send it in, because we are all out of time. Till we do meet again next time, keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.